There was a time when I seriously considered switching to Sony, and the A7 IV was at the top of my list of potential bodies to buy. For some reason, I could just never bring myself to pull the trigger though, and boy am I glad that I didn't, because after having this thing for a couple of days now, I realized that that would have been a massive mistake. My first big problem with this camera is price. It costs $2,500 brand new, which is the same as it cost back when it was released in 2021. In contrast, the Canon R6 Mark II, which is this camera, costs $500 less at $2,000. With such a contrast in price, you would think that the Sony must have quite a big upper hand over the R6 when it comes to specs, but it doesn't. So this is less about the Sony being bad. It's a perfectly fine camera, but it's more about the R6 Mark II and how it completely cleans the A7 IV's clock for $500 less. When it comes to video, both these cameras shoot beautiful footage with 4K 10-bit 422 codecs up to 60 frames per second internally. But while the R6 Mark II can do this without cropping, the A7 IV has to resort to a 1.5 times crop, which is pretty substantial just to manage the overheating. When combined with an external recorder like the Atomos Ninja 5, the R6 Mark II can also shoot 6K ProRes RAW video in up to 60 frames per second, which is insanely high quality, and it makes it a much better choice for filmmakers looking to get the absolute best image quality. I wouldn't consider this raw shooting to be a typical use case for the camera because it just takes so many extra steps to set it up with an external recorder, but it is nice to have that option there if you need it. Some people might argue that the R6 actually has a bit of an edge over the A7 IV when it comes to sharpness in their 4K modes, because the R6 is oversampling that 6K sensor down to 4K footage. Personally though, I don't see much of a difference here, and just in general, when it comes to video shooting, sharpness isn't my top concern. When it comes to high frame rate recording, the R6 Mark II wins out with a max frame rate of 180 FPS, beating the A7 IV's 120 FPS. I don't put a ton of weight on this though, because most people I know never even touch 120 FPS, especially since for both of these cameras, those modes are limited to 1080p. All these specs can be a lot to take in one sitting. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, I think the key takeaways are that the R6 Mark II can do 60 frames per second without cropping, while the A7 IV does have a pretty substantial 1.5 times crop in that mode, and the R6 can shoot that raw externally. When it comes to photography, the A7 IV is certainly capable of taking some incredible photos. With 33 megapixels, it actually beats the R6 Mark II on resolution, but technically speaking, or practically speaking I should say, it's really not going to be that much of a visual difference unless you do some really heavy cropping in on your photos. The difference between a 24 megapixel camera and a 33 is really only going to matter when you start blowing things up really big. Now for action or wildlife or event photographers, the Sony A7 IV shoots up to 10 frames per second in both mechanical and electronic shutter. In contrast, the R6 Mark II has an electronic burst mode where it shoots up to 40 raw photos in 1 second. That's an insanely massive difference, and it's almost double the amount of frames that I'm shooting in video mode right now. To make its case even stronger, the R6 Mark II has a pre-shooting mode when you're in that super high frame rate burst mode, which allows you to capture photos up to 1/2 of a second before you even fully press the shutter button. That way, even if your reflexes are a little bit slow, you're not gonna miss a shot. This is the R6 Mark II. This little marker right here on that timeline indicates where I actually pulled the shutter button. So from there, I can actually go back, I think it was 16 frames. Then if I move it forward, you'll see just how many extra frames I get on the R6 versus the Sony. When it comes down to it, the A7 IV is sort of just a great all-around camera with awesome features, but when it comes to shooting wildlife or sports or weddings, what you're gonna want is the R6 Mark II because you get those much more powerful burst modes. The only issue you're gonna have with this is picking the best shot out of 40 frames taken in 1 second. There's a few other things worth noting when comparing these two cameras. On paper, the R6 Mark II's autofocus is superior to the A7IV's because it has 1053 autofocus points across the sensor, while the Sony only has 753. Now, in practice, I actually don't think this makes a huge difference, although those numbers are kind of a substantial difference between each other. The autofocus actually performs really well on both of these cameras. The Canon wins when it comes to image stabilization for photos, with 8 stops of image stabilization versus the Sony's 5 stops. This makes getting handheld long exposure shots on the R6 Mark II much easier than on the Sony, which landscape and nature photographers will appreciate. This comparison actually flips when talking about video though, because for some reason when combining the IBIS of the R6 Mark II with the lens stabilization of Canon's lenses, I got this absolutely awful warping and wobble with a wide angle lens, to the point where this footage from the R6 Mark II is pretty much unusable. Now, I found that either turning off the R6's in-body image stabilization or the lens that I was using's stabilization would sort of mitigate this problem, but it's just an annoyance. So for walking or vlogging shots, I have to give the win to the Sony here. Finally, it could just be that I'm used to Canon, so take all that follows with a grain of salt, but I just prefer the feel of the R6. The ergonomics of the body are just more comfortable to me, and it feels like Canon's menu systems are just more accessible and intuitive. I found myself having to go into the main menu system of the A7IV far more often than I did with the R6 Mark II, because a lot of the settings that you need to adjust on the fly are accessible right from the touchscreen of the R6. That's not the case with the A7IV. On both of the camera bodies, you can control all of the main camera settings with their dials, all of the manual controls on the actual camera body. But if that's all that we're left with, then when you're in vlogging mode, which most people will be with the A7IV, it's very difficult to get those adjustments set. Whereas with the Canon, when you're in vlogging mode, since you have the potential or the ability to change those settings on the touchscreen, it's a lot easier if you're a creator, so you don't have to like flip the camera around every time you want to change the ISO. Again, it could just be my preference, but I think Canon's layout is better. So what does this mean? Well, it means that if you're trying to choose between the Canon R6 and the Sony A7IV, the R6 Mark II just knocks it out of the park and it blows the A7IV out of the water. So go with Canon if you're just trying to choose blanket between Sony and Canon, like which ecosystem you want to buy into. But if you're coming from a different Sony camera and you're thinking of upgrading your Sony to the A7IV, I would just sit back and wait a bit and see what Sony does with the A7V and how they answer the R6 Mark II, because right now this is just far too expensive for what you get. That said, if you're sold on the R6 Mark II, you should check out this video where I review Canon's best vlogging lens for this camera. I'm actually filming on it right now.